Imagine standing at a crossroads in your life. Behind you lies a path marked by mistakes, regrets, and choices you wish you could undo. Ahead of you stretches an uncertain future, and in your hand, you hold the weight of everything you've done wrong. Now, here's the question that will change everything. What if I told you that the very moment you're standing in right now, with all your imperfections and failures, is exactly where your transformation begins? What if the darkness you've experienced isn't a curse, but the fertile ground from which your greatest growth will emerge? Today, we're going to explore something profound that has been transforming lives for over 2,500 years. We're going to discover why the Buddha taught that no one is beyond redemption, why your past doesn't define your future, and most importantly, how you can begin the journey of transformation right now, in this very moment. This isn't just philosophy or empty spirituality. This is about real, practical wisdom that has the power to completely reshape how you see yourself, your mistakes, and your potential for change. Stay with me for the next hour, because by the end of this journey, you'll understand why every moment you've lived, including the darkest ones, has brought you to this point of possibility. The nature of human existence and error. Let's begin with a fundamental truth about the human condition. We live in a world where imperfection is not the exception but the rule. When we look at our lives honestly, we see a landscape dotted with moments of poor judgment, harmful actions, and words we wish we could take back. This is not a pessimistic view, but rather a realistic acknowledgement of what it means to be human. The Buddhist tradition recognizes this reality with profound clarity. We are beings who make mistakes, sometimes small ones and sometimes catastrophically large ones. The question is never whether we will err, but rather what we do when we inevitably do. Consider for a moment the concept of going astray. We use this phrase so casually in everyday conversation. When someone's life takes a destructive turn, we say they've lost their way. When a child begins making poor choices, parents lament that their child has gone astray. But what does this really mean? It means that at some point, the path we were walking, which we believed was leading us towards something good, has actually veered away from what truly brings well-being and happiness. The tragedy is that often we don't realize we're on the wrong path until we've traveled far down it. We wake up one day and wonder how we got so far from where we wanted to be. The beauty of Buddhist philosophy lies in its recognition that recognizing you're on the wrong path is not the end of your journey, but potentially its most important beginning. There's a term in Pali, the language of early Buddhist texts, that captures this perfectly. When someone realizes their error and turns toward the right path, they are said to be returning to the Sumagga, the good path. This isn't just about external behavior. It's about a fundamental reorientation of one's entire being, a turning of the mind and heart toward what is wholesome and life-affirming. But here's what makes this so challenging. We live in a world that often encourages us to hide our mistakes, to present a flawless image to others, to pretend we have it all together even when we're falling apart inside. Social media has amplified this tendency to an extreme degree. We curate perfect versions of our lives while hiding the messy reality. We see others highlight reels and feel inadequate about our behind-the-scenes struggles. This creates a profound disconnection, not just from others but from ourselves. We become strangers to our own truth, unable to look honestly at where we are and what we need to change. The Buddhist approach offers something radically different. It invites us to look directly at our errors without shame, but also without excuse. This is a delicate balance. On one side lies the trap of drowning in guilt and self-hatred, believing we're irredeemable. On the other side lies the trap of minimizing our mistakes, telling ourselves that everyone does wrong so it doesn't really matter. Both of these responses prevent genuine transformation. True change requires us to see our errors clearly, to acknowledge the harm they've caused to ourselves and others, and then to make a firm commitment to a different way of being. What makes someone capable of this kind of honest self-reflection and change? The Buddhist texts speak of certain conditions that make transformation possible. First, there must be what's called satpurusha asura, association with wise and virtuous people. When we surround ourselves only with those who encourage our destructive patterns or who are themselves caught in similar cycles of harmful behavior, change becomes nearly impossible. We need the influence of those who embody the qualities we aspire to develop. Second, there must be saddhamma savana, the opportunity to hear wise teachings that illuminate the path forward. This is why the transmission of wisdom through teaching has always been central to Buddhist practice. And third, there must be yoniso manasikara, wise attention or proper mental engagement with what we learn. It's not enough to hear wisdom passively. We must actively reflect on it, question it, test it against our experience, and integrate it into our understanding. The story of Angulimala, From destroyer to saint, to truly understand the transformative power of Buddhist philosophy, we need to examine one of its most extraordinary stories. This is the account of a man who committed terrible acts, who was feared and hated by an entire region, and who nevertheless achieved complete spiritual liberation in a single lifetime. His name was Angulimala, which means garland of fingers, and his story challenges everything we think we know about redemption and human potential. Let's set the scene. Over 100,000 eons ago, a Buddha named Padumuttara appeared in the world. During his time, there lived a person who heard the Buddha's teachings and even developed faith in the Dharma. But here's the critical point. Developing faith and understanding isn't a guarantee against falling back into darkness. The cycles of existence are long and complex. This faithful student of Padumuttara Buddha was reborn countless times, experiencing the ups and downs of conditioned existence. Sometimes influenced by positive conditions, sometimes by negative ones. The karmic seeds planted in that distant past would eventually bear fruit, but the journey would be far from straightforward. Fast forward to the time of our historical Buddha, Gautama, who taught in India about 2,500 years ago. In the kingdom of Kosala, there lived a Brahmin priest in the court of King Pasenadi. This priest and his wife conceived a child on a night that would prove significant. When the child was born, astrologers observed unusual omens. Weapons throughout the city, and even across the countryside, seemed to gleam with an unnatural light. This was interpreted as a sign that a child of tremendous power had been born, power that could manifest as either great good or terrible destruction. The king was consulted about these omens, and his response reveals much about the complexity of fate and choice. Rather than seeing this as inevitably negative, the king suggested naming the child Ahimsaka, which means the harmless one. The reasoning was profound. If we name someone for the quality we hope they'll embody, perhaps that quality will develop. And indeed, throughout his childhood and youth, Ahimsaka lived up to his name. He was gentle, kind, and showed no inclination toward violence. He wouldn't harm even the smallest creature. At 16, Ahimsaka was sent to Takshashila, the great ancient university, to study various arts and sciences. He was a brilliant student, quickly becoming his teacher's favorite. But here the story takes a dark turn that reveals something crucial about human nature and the origins of wrongdoing. Among Ahimsaka's fellow students, jealousy arose. This seemingly innocuous emotion, so common that we barely notice it, would prove to be the seed of terrible suffering. The jealous students couldn't accept that Ahimsaka was more skilled, more beloved by the teacher, more successful than they were. So they plotted. They went to their teacher and planted seeds of suspicion. They suggested that Ahimsaka and the teacher's wife were having an inappropriate relationship. Now, this was completely false, but repeated whispers, especially about something scandalous, have a way of taking root even in wise minds. The teacher began to doubt, and rather than confronting Ahimsaka directly with these accusations, which would have given the young man a chance to defend himself, the teacher devised a test. He told Ahimsaka that to complete his education, he needed to present a final Guru Dakshina, a teacher's gift. And the gift he demanded was horrifying. He told Ahimsaka to go into the forest, kill 1,000 people, and bring back one finger from each victim as proof. Now, why would a teacher make such a demand? This wasn't really about education or tradition. The teacher expected that Ahimsaka would be killed in the attempt. Either he would be stopped by the people he tried to attack, or he would be caught and executed by the authorities. Either way, the problem would be eliminated. But the teacher underestimated the skills he himself had taught Ahimsaka and the young man's sense of duty and obedience. So Ahimsaka took up his sword and entered the forest near Savatthi. And there, driven by what he believed was his duty to his teacher, he began killing travelers. At first, he kept the fingers separately, but animals would steal them. So he began stringing the fingers together and wearing them as a garland around his neck. Thus Ahimsaka, the harmless one, became Angulimala, the wearer of the finger garland. Think about what's happening here psychologically and spiritually. A young man who was naturally gentle has been manipulated into committing atrocities. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It happened through a series of steps, each one making the next seem more acceptable. First, the acceptance of an authority figure's demand, even when it felt wrong. Then the first killing, which broke through a natural human resistance to taking life. Then each subsequent killing became easier as he developed callousness, as he convinced himself he was doing what he had to do. This is how good people become capable of terrible things. Not usually through a sudden choice to be evil, but through a gradual erosion of moral sensitivity, often in service to what they've been told is a higher purpose. The region around Savatthi became terrorized. Villages were abandoned. People were too frightened to travel. Angulimala had become the most feared person in the land. And here's something the texts make clear about his condition at this point. He had become tremendously powerful, not just in combat skill, but in other abilities as well. He could run faster than a horse. Armies sent against him were scattered. He had become, in a sense, superhuman in his capacity for destruction. Now we come to the moment that changes everything. Angulimala's mother, hearing what her son had become, decided to go to him. Despite everything, she was his mother, and she believed that if she could just speak to him, she could bring him back from this darkness. But Angulimala had made a vow. He needed 1,000 fingers for his garland. He had 999. He needed just one more, and his vow was absolute. Whoever he saw next would be his final victim, even if it was his own mother. At this precise moment, the Buddha intervened. The Buddha, with his extraordinary perception, saw what was about to happen. If Angulimala killed his mother, he would commit matricide, one of the 5 most karmically destructive acts possible. This would make his path to liberation exponentially more difficult, possibly foreclosing the possibility entirely for countless lifetimes. So the Buddha, moved by compassion for both the mother and the son, went into the forest himself. Angulimala saw the Buddha approaching. Here was his final victim. The Buddha walked calmly, serenely, his saffron robes brilliant in the sunlight. Angulimala charged at him with his sword raised, but something extraordinary happened. No matter how fast Angulimala ran, the Buddha, who was simply walking at his normal pace, stayed ahead of him. For 3 yajanas, roughly 30 kilometers, Angulimala pursued the Buddha at top speed, and he couldn't close the distance. Finally, exhausted, Angulimala stopped and cried out, "Stop, ascetic, stop!" And the Buddha turned to him and said something that contains the entire teaching. "Angulimala, I stopped long ago. It is you who has not stopped." Confused, Angulimala asked what he meant. How could the Buddha claim to have stopped when he was walking and tell Angulimala to stop when he was standing still? The Buddha explained, "Angulimala, I stopped killing living beings long ago. You, even though you stand still now, have not stopped. You continue to kill." In that moment, something shifted in Angulimala's consciousness. He saw, perhaps for the first time since beginning his terrible vow, the reality of what he had become. The Buddha's words cut through all his rationalizations, all his sense of duty to his teacher, all the callousness he had developed. And in seeing clearly, he made a choice. He dropped his sword, and in that simple act, Angulimala's transformation began. The Buddha ordained Angulimala as a monk on the spot. They returned together to the monastery at Savatthi. When King Pasenadi, who had been preparing a major military expedition to capture or kill Angulimala, came to visit the Buddha and learned that the terrible Angulimala was now sitting there as a monk, his reaction was telling. He was both frightened and amazed. The Buddha asked him, "If you saw that someone who had committed terrible acts, who had lived a life of violence, had given all that up and was now striving in virtue and wisdom, training in morality, concentration, and wisdom, what would you do?" King replied that he would honor such a person as he would honor any virtuous monk. But here's what's crucial about Angulimala's story, and this is where we see the unflinching realism of Buddhist teaching. Becoming a monk and beginning spiritual practice didn't erase the karmic consequences of Angulimala's actions. When he went on alms round in the town, people threw stones at him. They beat him. They couldn't forget what he had done. Even though he was now harmless, even though he was striving for goodness, the effects of past actions continued to ripen. The texts describe the Buddha encountering Angulimala one day, his head bleeding, his robes torn, his bowl broken. And the Buddha said to him, "Bear it, Brahmin, bear it. The suffering you are experiencing now in this life is saving you from suffering you would have experienced in hell for countless eons." This is the law of karma operating with precise justice. But here's the amazing thing. Despite all this external suffering, despite the hatred and violence directed at him, Angulimala achieved full enlightenment in that very lifetime. He became an arahant, one who has extinguished all defilements and will experience no further rebirth. The mind that had been capable of killing 1,000 people became completely pure, completely free. Understanding karma and consequences, Angulimala's story brings us face to face with one of Buddhism's most important and most commonly misunderstood teachings, the principle of karma. In popular understanding, karma has become almost synonymous with fate or cosmic punishment. "It's my karma," people say, suggesting a kind of helpless resignation to suffering. But this completely misses what the Buddha actually taught about karma. The word karma simply means action, but not just any action. It specifically refers to intentional action, action driven by volition. And the Buddha's revolutionary insight was that it's not the external nature of an act that determines its karmic weight, but the intention behind it and the mental states that motivate it. Two people can perform the same external action with completely different karmic results depending on what's happening in their minds. The Buddha illustrated this with a memorable teaching. Imagine you take a small lump of salt and drop it into a cup of water. The water becomes undrinkably salty. Now imagine you take that same lump of salt and drop it into the Ganges River. The vast flow of the river dilutes it completely. You wouldn't even notice it. The same quantity of salt, completely different results depending on the context. This is how karma works with different individuals. A small unwholesome action performed by someone whose mind is narrow, whose capacity for goodness is undeveloped, can have terrible consequences. It's like dropping salt into a cup. The person's entire experience becomes saturated with the results. But the same action performed by someone who has developed a vast mind, who has cultivated extensive goodness, who has trained in ethics and wisdom, has much less serious consequences. It's diluted by the great river of positive qualities they've developed. This is why the teaching emphasizes so strongly the importance of developing wholesome qualities, not just avoiding unwholesome actions. When we expand our capacity for kindness, for generosity, for wisdom, we're not just making ourselves feel good. We're literally changing the karmic landscape of our lives. We're transforming the cup of our consciousness into a vast river. But there's another dimension to this that's equally important. Karma is not a mechanistic law like gravity. It operates through consciousness and can be influenced by consciousness. This is why repentance, making amends, and changing one's behavior matter so much. They don't erase the past, but they do affect how karmic results unfold. Think of it this way. Imagine you've planted a bitter seed in a field. That seed has the potential to grow into a plant that produces bitter fruit. This is like an unwholesome action you've performed. The karmic seed has been planted. Now you can't unplant it. The action has been done. But you can change the conditions in which it grows. If you tend the field carefully, if you plant many wholesome seeds around it, if you cultivate the soil with goodness, when that bitter seed finally sprouts, it will be surrounded by so much that is wholesome that its bitterness will barely be noticeable. This is what developing virtue, wisdom, and mental cultivation does. It changes the field of consciousness in which our karmic seeds ripen. This is precisely what happened with Angulimala. Yes, he committed terrible actions. The seeds were planted. And yes, he experienced painful results, being beaten and reviled wherever he went. But because he so thoroughly transformed his mind, because he cultivated such profound virtue and wisdom, those results, though painful, were manageable. They occurred in the context of a vast, spacious awareness that could hold them without being overwhelmed. And most crucially, he prevented himself from planting any more destructive seeds. He stopped creating new causes for suffering. This brings us to something absolutely vital for anyone trying to transform their life. There's a world of difference between regretting the past and dwelling in guilt about it. Regret can be wholesome if it motivates change. When we look at our past mistakes and think, I see the harm I caused and I'm committed to not repeating that pattern, that's healthy regret. It's a sign of moral maturity. But when we look at our past mistakes and spiral into shame, when we tell ourselves we're fundamentally bad or irredeemable, when we spend hours or days or years marinating in guilt, that's not helpful. In fact, it's actively harmful because it keeps us trapped in the past rather than moving forward. The Buddha made this distinction very clear. He taught that there are two kinds of people. The first kind, when they make a mistake, acknowledge it, learn from it, and move on. They use the mistake as a teacher. The second kind, when they make a mistake, either deny it and make excuses or they drown in guilt and self-recrimination. Neither of these responses leads to growth. So here's a question worth sitting with. When you think about your own past mistakes, your own areas of life where you've gone astray, what's your relationship to them? Are you someone who can look at your errors clearly, acknowledge them, learn from them, and then actively work on not repeating them? Or do you find yourself either making excuses or spiraling into self-hatred? Your answer to this question will largely determine whether your past becomes a weight that drags you down or a teacher that helps you grow. The practice of transformation, developing the body of virtue. Now we come to the practical heart of the teaching. Understanding that transformation is possible is crucial, but transformation itself requires action. The Buddha taught a progressive path of development that begins exactly where you are right now, with whatever limitations and challenges you face. This path has several dimensions, and we're going to explore each one in depth. The first dimension is what the Buddha called Bhavita Kaya, the developed body. This doesn't primarily mean physical exercise, though taking care of your physical health is certainly part of a wise life. Rather, it refers to developing your entire physical presence and behavior in ways that reflect and support wholesome qualities. Let's make this concrete. Think about your relationship with sacred places or objects. In countries where Buddhism is practiced, there are ancient stupas, temples, and monuments that house relics of the Buddha or other awakened beings. These places are venerated not because of superstition, but because they serve as powerful reminders of what's possible for human consciousness. They point beyond themselves to the potential for complete freedom from suffering. Now here's an interesting observation about human behavior. Many people will travel to these sacred sites, but when they arrive, they're so caught up in other concerns that they barely notice them. They might take a quick photo for social media, check it off their list, and move on. Or they arrive with their minds entirely occupied by their smartphones, scrolling through feeds, missing the opportunity for genuine connection with something meaningful. This reveals something important about the quality of our attention and presence. We've become so habituated to distraction, to always looking at the next thing rather than being fully present with what's right in front of us, that we miss opportunities for experiences that could actually nourish us. Developing the body in Buddhist terms begins with this. It means training ourselves to be fully present, to engage completely with what we're doing rather than always being half here and half somewhere else. Consider something as simple as making a gesture of respect. In Buddhist cultures, people place their palms together and bow when encountering something sacred. This is an empty ritual. It's a physical expression of recognition and reverence. It's a way of training the body to embody certain attitudes. And here's what's interesting. When you consistently perform these physical acts of respect, even if your mind is initially distracted, the physical action begins to train the mind. The body teaches the mind how to be reverent, how to be present, how to recognize what's valuable. But so many people have lost this entirely. They might be standing in front of one of the most sacred sites in the world, a place that has been venerated for millennia, and their hands are occupied holding a phone to take a selfie. Both hands are engaged in capturing an image rather than in the simple act of placing palms together in respect. And the mind is occupied with thoughts about how the photo will look, how many likes it might get, rather than with any genuine encounter with the sacred. This is a symptom of a much larger problem. We become so focused on documenting our experiences that we're not actually having the experiences. We're so concerned with our curated online personas that we're losing touch with authentic being. And this has profound consequences for our capacity to transform. Because transformation requires presence. It requires the ability to be fully here, fully engaged with reality as it is, rather than constantly mediating everything through layers of self-consciousness and performance. Developing the body, then, begins with simple practices. When you encounter something worthy of respect, actually stop and offer respect. When you visit a sacred place, put your phone away and be there completely. When you see a monk or a person of genuine virtue, place your hands together in respect. These aren't empty gestures. They're training exercises for the heart and mind. This extends to how we treat our parents and elders. One of the practices the Buddha emphasized repeatedly was showing respect and gratitude to those who raised us. Your parents, whatever their limitations, kept you alive when you were utterly helpless. They changed your diapers, they fed you, they lost sleep worrying about you. Even if your relationship with them is complicated, even if they made mistakes, as all parents do, this basic fact remains: they are the reason you're alive. Acknowledging this, showing respect for it, isn't about pretending everything was perfect. It's about recognizing a fundamental truth and aligning your behavior with that truth. And here's what happens when you develop these physical practices of respect and presence. Your consciousness begins to shift. The cynicism and reactivity that characterize so much of modern life begin to soften. You become more capable of recognizing what's valuable, what's beautiful, what's worthy of care and attention. And this prepares the ground for deeper transformation. The foundation of ethical conduct, the second dimension of the path, is Bhavita Sila, developed virtue or ethical conduct. This is where many people either completely miss the point or misunderstand in ways that make the practice seem oppressive rather than liberating. So let's be very clear about what ethical training in Buddhism really means. The foundation of Buddhist ethics is a set of 5 precepts, 5 commitments that serve as a baseline for living without causing unnecessary harm. These are abstaining from killing living beings, abstaining from taking what's not given, abstaining from sexual misconduct, abstaining from false speech, and abstaining from intoxicants that cloud the mind. On the surface, these might seem like arbitrary rules, but each one addresses a specific way that human beings tend to cause suffering to themselves and others. Let's take them one by one. The first precept, abstaining from killing, is training in basic respect for life. It recognizes that every being values its own existence and experiences, feels pain and fear just as you do. When you commit to not intentionally taking life, you're training yourself to extend your circle of empathy beyond just yourself and those you're close to. You're recognizing the value of life as such. Now, in practical terms, different Buddhist traditions and practitioners interpret this precept with varying degrees of strictness. Some extend it to include all insects and even plants where possible. Others take a more moderate approach, focusing on not killing animals and humans. The key is not rigid adherence to someone else's interpretation, but rather developing genuine sensitivity to the presence of life around you and minimizing harm as best you can. The second precept, abstaining from taking what's not given, goes beyond just obvious theft. It includes any way we might take from others without their free consent. This could be stealing credit for someone else's work, using resources without permission, or even taking more than our fair share in situations where things are meant to be equally distributed. When you train in this precept, you're developing honesty and contentment with what's rightfully yours rather than constantly grasping for more. The third precept, abstaining from sexual misconduct, is about respecting the commitments and boundaries in intimate relationships. It means not engaging in sexual activity that betrays trust, that violates someone else's commitments, or that treats people as objects for your gratification rather than as full human beings worthy of respect. In a culture that's often casual about sex, while simultaneously dealing with epidemic levels of dysfunction around intimacy, this precept invites us to bring consciousness and care to one of the most powerful aspects of human life. The fourth precept, abstaining from false speech, might seem straightforward, but it's actually one of the most challenging. It's not just about not telling outright lies. It's about cultivating truthfulness in all your communication. This includes not exaggerating to make yourself look better, not omitting important information that others need to make informed decisions, not speaking in ways designed to manipulate or deceive even if what you say is technically true. When you train seriously in this precept, you begin to notice how often casual dishonesty shows up in everyday life, and you begin to develop the courage and integrity to be straightforward even when it's uncomfortable. The fifth precept, abstaining from intoxicants, addresses the fact that mindfulness and clear awareness are essential for any kind of genuine spiritual development. When you're intoxicated, whether with alcohol, recreational drugs, or even excessive use of prescribed medications, your capacity for clear perception and wise choice is compromised. Now, this doesn't mean that anyone who occasionally has a drink is violating Buddhist ethics. Different practitioners and traditions take different approaches, but the underlying principle is clear. If you want to transform your mind, you need to keep it clear and functional. Here's what's crucial to understand about these precepts. They're not commandments handed down from on high that you follow out of fear of punishment. They're training principles. They're practices that, when you engage with them sincerely, gradually transform your character. Every time you're tempted to lie and choose honesty instead, you're strengthening integrity. Every time you feel angry and refrain from acting out violently, you're cultivating restraint and patience. Every time you respect someone else's boundaries, even though you could take advantage of them, you're developing respect and trustworthiness. And here's something that might surprise you. Following these ethical guidelines doesn't make life dull or restrictive. It actually makes life much simpler and more peaceful. Think about it. When you're committed to being honest, you don't have to keep track of what lies you've told to whom. When you're committed to respecting others' property and relationships, you don't have to worry about getting caught or dealing with the fallout from betrayal. When you're committed to not harming, you can move through the world with a clear conscience. Ethical conduct isn't a burden. It's actually a tremendous relief. But developing this kind of conduct requires strength. It requires what Buddhism calls virya, energy, or heroic effort. It's easy to be ethical when there's no temptation, when you're not under pressure, when doing the right thing costs you nothing. The real test comes when you're tempted, when lying would be easier, when stealing would solve an immediate problem, when giving in to anger would feel satisfying in the moment. That's when you need real moral courage. This is why the teaching says that only someone with great strength of character can maintain ethical conduct. Weak people, people without developed willpower, will constantly compromise their principles for short-term convenience or gratification. They'll tell themselves that this one time doesn't matter, that everyone else is doing it, that they deserve a break from trying to be good. But every time you make that compromise, you're weakening your own integrity. You're training yourself to be unreliable to yourself and to others. Strong people, people with developed character, can look at a situation where violating their principles would be advantageous in the short term and still choose integrity. They have the vision to see that long-term well-being depends on being someone you can trust, someone whose word means something, someone who lives by their values even when it's difficult. And when you develop that kind of strength, something amazing happens. You begin to respect yourself, not in an arrogant way, but with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're trying your best to live honorably. Cultivating the mind. The heart of transformation, the third dimension of development, is Bhavita Siddha, the cultivated mind. This is really the heart of Buddhist practice, because everything we experience, everything we do, flows from the quality of our consciousness. You can have perfect external circumstances and be miserable if your mind is full of greed, hatred, and delusion. You can face difficult circumstances and remain peaceful if your mind is trained in wholesome qualities. Now, developing the mind is a vast topic. There are entire traditions of Buddhist meditation practice devoted to different aspects of mental cultivation. We could spend months just on concentration practice, or months on insight meditation, or months on practices for cultivating specific wholesome qualities. But for our purposes, I want to focus on two particular qualities that are absolutely foundational. If you develop nothing else, develop these two. They are metta, loving kindness, and mudita, empathetic joy. Let's start with metta, loving kindness. This is the quality of benevolence, of wishing all beings well, of wanting others to be happy. Not in a naive way that ignores real problems, but as a fundamental orientation of heart. When you encounter another person, any person, the first response of a heart filled with metta is, I hope you're well. I hope you're happy. I hope you're free from suffering. This might sound simple, almost trivial, but cultivating this quality transforms your entire relationship to the world. Think about your normal state of mind when you move through public spaces. If you're like most people, you're largely indifferent to the strangers around you. They're just part of the scenery, obstacles to navigate around, or at worst, annoyances if they are in your way or behaving in ways you find irritating. You're not actively wishing them ill, but you're not particularly wishing them well either. They simply don't register as beings whose well-being matters to you. Now imagine moving through the same space with a mind trained in metta. You see the tired mother with a crying baby and your heart goes out to her. You silently wish, may you be patient, may you be strong, may you and your child be well. You see the elderly person struggling with heavy bags and you feel a spontaneous impulse to help. You see even people who are behaving obnoxiously and instead of irritation you feel compassion. May you find peace. May you be free from whatever suffering drives you to act this way. This isn't just being nice. It's actually rewiring your brain. Neuroscience research on meditation practitioners has shown that consistent practice of loving-kindness meditation literally changes the structure and function of the brain, enhancing areas associated with empathy and emotional regulation, while decreasing activity in areas associated with anxiety and stress. But you don't need scientific studies to know this works. You can feel it directly. When you move through the world with genuine goodwill toward others, you feel better. Your own mind becomes a more pleasant place to inhabit. But here's where it gets challenging. Cultivating metta toward people who are easy to love, people you already like, people who are kind to you, that's relatively easy. The real practice comes with difficult people, the person who betrayed you, the colleague who's always putting you down, the family member who just seems to know how to push your buttons. Can you extend metta even to them? Can you find it in your heart to wish them well, not because they deserve it by your standards, but simply because they are human beings who, like you, want to be happy and want to avoid suffering? This is where metta practice becomes truly transformative. Because when you can extend goodwill even to difficult people, something miraculous happens. The resentment you've been carrying, the grudges that have been weighing you down, they begin to dissolve. You realize that hating someone doesn't hurt them, it hurts you. It's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. When you let go of that hatred and replace it with metta, even if it's just a willingness to wish them well rather than an emotional feeling, you free yourself. Now let's talk about mudita, empathetic joy. This might be the most radical and countercultural of all the Buddhist practices. Mudita is the quality of rejoicing in others' happiness and success. When something good happens to someone else, instead of feeling jealous or envious or somehow diminished, you feel genuinely happy for them. You celebrate their good fortune as if it were your own. This is incredibly difficult in a culture that's built on competition and comparison. We're constantly being told that life is a zero-sum game, that if someone else wins, you lose. Social media has amplified this to a toxic degree. We scroll through continue 18, 17 feeds seeing everyone else's vacations, accomplishments, happy relationships, and instead of feeling happy for them, we feel inadequate. We feel like we're falling behind. Or worse, we feel a kind of schadenfreude, a secret pleasure in others' misfortunes, because at least then we don't feel so bad about our own situation. Mudita is the antidote to all of this. When you see someone who's more attractive than you, instead of feeling insecure, you think, how wonderful that beauty exists in the world. When you see someone who's more successful, instead of feeling envious, you think, how inspiring that such achievement is possible. When you see someone in a loving relationship, instead of feeling lonely, you think, may all beings find such love. This doesn't mean pretending you don't have your own aspirations or challenges. It doesn't mean you can't work to improve your own situation. But it means not making your happiness dependent on comparison with others. It means recognizing that there's room for everyone to flourish. Someone else's success doesn't diminish you. Their happiness doesn't subtract from the total amount of happiness available in the universe. And here's the beautiful paradox. When you cultivate mudita, when you genuinely rejoice in others' good fortune, you actually become happier yourself. Because every time something good happens to anyone in your awareness, you have an opportunity for joy. Instead of your happiness being limited to just the good things that happen to you personally, which are relatively rare, you can experience joy countless times a day by participating in the happiness of all the beings around you. Cultivating these qualities, metta and mudita, is actually quite simple in method, though it requires consistent practice. You can start with just a few minutes a day. Sit quietly, bring to mind someone you care about, and silently repeat phrases like, "May you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be safe, may you live with ease." Feel the warmth of goodwill in your heart as you do this. Then gradually expand the practice to include neutral people, then difficult people, then all beings everywhere. For mudita, you can practice throughout the day. When you hear good news about anyone, pause for a moment and let yourself feel genuinely happy for them. When you see someone laughing or clearly enjoying themselves, let their joy touch you. When you witness any kind of success or good fortune, silently think, "May you continue to prosper. May you continue to be happy. May this good fortune not be lost." These practices might seem small, but they're actually working at the deepest level of consciousness, transforming the very orientation of your being from self-centered to open-hearted, from competitive to celebratory, from constricted to expansive. Growing wisdom. The ultimate freedom, the fourth and final dimension of development, is bhavita panya, cultivated wisdom. This is what ultimately liberates the mind completely. You can have well-developed ethical conduct, you can have a concentrated and calm mind, but without wisdom, you haven't penetrated to the root of suffering, and without that penetration, complete freedom remains elusive. Now, what is wisdom in the Buddhist sense? It's not the same as being clever or knowledgeable. You can know a tremendous amount of information and still be foolish in how you live. Wisdom is direct insight into the nature of reality, specifically into what are called the three characteristics of existence. These are anicca, impermanence, dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, and anatta, not self. Understanding these intellectually is one thing. Seeing them directly, viscerally, in your own experience, that's wisdom. Let's take impermanence first. Intellectually, we all know that everything changes. We know that we're aging, that the people we love will eventually die, that everything we own will eventually break or decay, that every pleasure we experience will end. We know all this, and yet we live as if things were permanent. We make plans as if we have unlimited time. We take relationships for granted. We act as if youth and health and the presence of loved ones will last forever. Wisdom means seeing impermanence so clearly that it transforms how you live. You look at your aging parents and you really see that your time with them is limited, and that seeing motivates you to be present with them, to appreciate them now rather than putting it off. You look at your own body and you really see that its vitality won't last, and that seeing motivates you to use your energy wisely rather than squandering it on trivialities. You look at your relationships and you really see that they're precious precisely because they're temporary, and that seeing motivates you to nurture them with care. The story of Prince Siddhartha, who would become the Buddha, illustrates this perfectly. When he was 29 years old, he left the palace for the first time and encountered what are called the four sights. He saw an old person, a sick person, a corpse, and finally a contemplative monk seeking liberation. These four sights shook him so deeply because he really saw them. He didn't just notice them intellectually and move on. He understood that aging, sickness, and death were not just things that happened to other people. They were his own inevitable fate. And that understanding created such a sense of urgency that he renounced his entire comfortable life to seek a solution to suffering. Most of us, even when we encounter old age, sickness, and death, we find ways to keep it at arm's length. We tell ourselves that we have time, that we're still young enough, that we'll deal with it later. This is a failure of wisdom. True wisdom means letting the reality of impermanence in, letting it inform your choices, letting it wake you up to the preciousness of this fleeting existence. The second characteristic is dukkha, usually translated as suffering, but perhaps better understood as unsatisfactoriness. This is the recognition that nothing in conditioned existence provides lasting happiness. Everything we cling to either changes and disappoints us, or even if it doesn't change, our very clinging makes it a source of stress rather than peace. The beautiful sunset that fills you with joy. You want to hold onto that feeling, but it fades. The person you love, you want them to always be exactly as they are, but they change, you change, and that constant flux creates friction. Wisdom sees this clearly and understands that the solution isn't to find better things to cling to. The solution is to change our relationship to things entirely. Instead of grasping, we can appreciate without clinging. Instead of demanding that things be different from how they are, we can accept reality while still working skillfully to reduce suffering where possible. This doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent. It means becoming profoundly engaged with life while no longer being enslaved by your reactions to it. The third characteristic is anatta, not self. This is probably the most challenging and most commonly misunderstood Buddhist teaching. It doesn't mean that you don't exist or that you're just an illusion. It means that what you take to be yourself, this supposedly solid, unchanging entity that's the subject of all your experiences, doesn't actually exist the way you think it does. What you call I or me is actually a constantly changing process, a flow of physical and mental phenomena that arise and pass away moment by moment in dependence on conditions. Wisdom means seeing this directly, and when you do, something profound happens. The sense of being a separate, isolated self defending itself against a threatening world begins to relax. You realize that you're not fundamentally separate from the rest of existence. You're part of a vast, interconnected process. And in that realization, much of your suffering dissolves, because suffering depends on identifying something as mine and then feeling threatened when it's challenged or changes. When you see through the illusion of a separate self, that whole mechanism of suffering loses its power. Now, I want to be very clear about something. These insights, these aspects of wisdom, they don't come primarily from reading about them or thinking about them, though that can help. They come from sustained meditation practice, from actually investigating your direct experience moment by moment until you see these truths for yourself. The Buddha said, "I am just one who shows the way. You must make the effort yourselves." The teaching can point you in the right direction, but you have to walk the path. This is why the teaching emphasizes the importance of hearing the Dharma, reflecting on it deeply, and then practicing it. If you only hear the teaching but never reflect on it, it remains superficial, just nice ideas. If you reflect but never practice, it remains theoretical, just philosophy. But when you hear teachings that point to truth, reflect on them until you understand them conceptually, and then verify them through your own direct experience in meditation and in daily life. That's when transformation becomes complete and irreversible. The preciousness of human life and opportunity. Let's step back now and consider something that the Buddhist tradition emphasizes again and again. You have something incredibly precious right now in this moment. You have a human life, consciousness, the opportunity to hear liberating teachings, and the freedom to practice them. The tradition describes this as an extraordinarily rare conjunction of circumstances. Think about it this way. In the Buddhist cosmology, there are countless realms of existence, countless ways that consciousness can manifest. Most of these realms don't offer the conditions necessary for spiritual development. If consciousness is born in a realm of extreme suffering, like the hell realms described in Buddhist texts, or even just in situations of extreme poverty or oppression or violence, survival becomes all-consuming. There's no space for reflection, for practice, for growth. If consciousness is born in realms of extreme pleasure, like some of the heavenly realms, there's no motivation for practice. Why work on liberation when everything feels perfect? But human existence occupies a unique middle ground. We have enough suffering to motivate seeking liberation. We experience enough of aging, sickness, disappointment, and loss to understand viscerally that something is fundamentally unsatisfactory about unawakened existence. But we also have enough comfort, enough security, enough leisure to actually engage in practice. We have the cognitive capacity to understand complex teachings. We have the freedom to make choices about how we live. And even more rare than just human birth is the conjunction of being born at a time when authentic teachings are available. The Buddha taught that there are vast periods of cosmic time when no Buddha appears in the world, when the teachings are completely lost. According to tradition, we're currently living in the dispensation of Gautama Buddha, meaning his teachings are still available, still being practiced, still bearing fruit in terms of people achieving awakening. But this won't last forever. The tradition says that eventually these teachings will fade, be corrupted, or be forgotten, and there will be another long period of darkness before the next Buddha appears. From this perspective, the opportunity you have right now, reading or hearing teachings that come down through an unbroken lineage from the Buddha himself, being able to practice them in relative freedom and safety, this is unbelievably precious. It's like being handed a treasure map while standing right at the spot where the treasure is buried. What are you going to do with this opportunity? I bring this up not to make you anxious, but to help you appreciate what you have. So often we take for granted the things that are most valuable. We think we have unlimited time to get around to practicing seriously. We tell ourselves we'll start meditating every day after we finish this project at work, after things settle down at home, after we feel more motivated. But the teaching reminds us that time is limited, opportunities are rare, and the moment to begin is always now. Consider this. You're hearing these teachings right now. Some of what's being said is probably resonating with you, touching something true in your experience. That resonance, that sense of recognition, that's incredibly valuable. It's the seed of wisdom beginning to sprout. What are you going to do to nurture that seed? Are you going to allow the concerns and distractions of everyday life to crowd it out? Or are you going to give it the attention, the time, the commitment it needs to grow? The Buddha's teaching on this is both compassionate and urgent. He acknowledged that life is short, that opportunities are fleeting, that we really don't know how much time we have. The monk Angulimala's mother set out to see her son, not knowing if she'd survive the encounter. King Pasenadi set out to capture Angulimala, not knowing how it would end. Every day, people make plans assuming they'll be alive tomorrow, and some of them are wrong. This isn't meant to terrify you. It's meant to wake you up to the truth that right now, in this present moment, is the only time you actually have. So the teaching asks, if you knew you only had a year to live, how would you spend it? Would you spend it scrolling through social media, caught up in petty concerns, living on autopilot? Or would you use that time to develop wisdom, to cultivate love, to free your mind from the patterns that cause suffering? And if that's how you'd live with only a year, why aren't you living that way now? Because the truth is, you might have a year, you might have 50 years, or you might have just a few months. You don't know. This isn't morbid. It's liberating. When you really internalize the preciousness and fragility of this existence, it cuts through so much of what we usually waste time and energy on. The ancient practitioners used to keep a piece of cloth from a corpse to remind themselves of death. Not because they were obsessed with death, but because remembering death clarifies what actually matters. It helps you distinguish between what's truly important and what's just noise. Practical steps, beginning your transformation, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the nature of going astray and returning to the right path. We've explored the story of Angulimala and what it teaches about the possibility of transformation. We've discussed karma and how past actions don't determine your future if you transform your present. We've examined the 4 dimensions of development, cultivating virtue through the body, maintaining ethical conduct, training the mind in wholesome qualities, and developing wisdom. And we've reflected on the preciousness of this opportunity you have right now. Now I want to get very practical. What does this actually look like in your daily life? How do you begin? Because understanding is valuable, but understanding alone doesn't change anything. You have to put these teachings into practice. First, and this is absolutely foundational, you need to create space for reflection. In our hyper-connected, constantly stimulated world, most people go through entire days, even entire years, without ever stopping to really look at their lives. You're always responding to the next email, the next notification, the next demand. You're always in reactive mode. And in that state, deep change is impossible. So start by creating even just 10 or 15 minutes a day where you stop. No phone, no music, no distractions. Just sit quietly and ask yourself some questions. What did I do today? How did I speak to people? What was the quality of my mind? Where did I act from wisdom and where did I act from confusion or reactivity? Don't judge yourself harshly for what you find. Just observe. This simple practice of daily reflection will begin to create a kind of witness consciousness that can see your patterns more clearly. Second, choose one area where you know you need to change and make it your focus. Trying to transform everything at once is overwhelming and usually leads to failure. But if you pick one specific pattern and really work with it, you can make significant progress. Maybe you know you have a problem with angry outbursts, or with being dishonest in small ways, or with judging others harshly. Whatever it is, acknowledge it honestly, not to beat yourself up about it, but as the first step in changing it. Once you've identified a pattern, set a clear intention each morning. Today, I'm going to watch for situations where anger arises and I'm going to pause before reacting. Or, today, I'm going to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Or, today, when I notice myself judging someone, I'm going to silently wish them well instead. This kind of specific, focused intention gives your mind something concrete to work with. Third, find ways to remember these intentions throughout the day. One of the biggest challenges is that we set an intention in the morning and then completely forget about it by mid-morning when we're caught up in the demands of the day. You need reminders. Maybe you set an alarm on your phone that goes off a few times a day with a message like, "Am I being present?" Or, "Is my mind wholesome right now?" Maybe you put a sticky note on your bathroom mirror or your computer monitor. The specific method doesn't matter. What matters is creating interruptions to autopilot mode that bring you back to awareness. Fourth, connect with others who are on a similar path. This is what the Buddha called spiritual friendship, and he said it's not just helpful for practice, it's actually the whole of practice. When you're surrounded by people who share your values, who are also trying to live more consciously and ethically, it makes a huge difference. Their example inspires you. Their struggles help you feel less alone in your own. Their insights illuminate things you might have missed. This might mean finding a local meditation group or Buddhist Sangha, or it might mean forming a small group with friends who want to study these teachings together. or even just finding one person who can be your practice partner, someone you check in with regularly about how your practice is going, what challenges you're facing, what you're learning. Fifth, be patient but persistent. Transformation doesn't happen overnight. You're working against patterns that have been developing for years, possibly for your entire life, possibly for many lifetimes if you take the Buddhist cosmology seriously. These patterns won't disappear just because you decide you want them to. They'll reassert themselves again and again, and every time they do, you have a choice. You can either fall into the familiar pattern or you can use that moment as an opportunity for practice. This is where so many people get discouraged. They start practicing with enthusiasm, they make some progress, and then they hit a setback. They lose their temper despite their intention to be patient. They lie despite their commitment to honesty, and they think, see, I can't change, I'm hopeless. But that's exactly wrong. The setback isn't proof that practice doesn't work. It's part of the process. The question isn't whether you'll ever fail, you will. The question is what you do after the failure. Do you give up? Or do you acknowledge the failure, learn from it, and renew your intention? The Buddha described the path as training. Think about what training means in any other context. If you're training your body, you don't expect to be able to run a marathon on your first day. You start small. You build gradually. You have setbacks when you get injured or sick, but you keep going. Mental and spiritual training works the same way. You're building strength, developing new capacities. And just like physical training, consistency matters much more than intensity. Someone who meditates for 20 minutes every day will make much more progress than someone who meditates for 3 hours once a month. Living the transformed life as you persist in this practice. As you keep coming back to your intentions day after day, something begins to shift. At first, the changes are small and might be barely noticeable. You catch yourself about to react angrily and you pause just for a second before responding. You're about to tell a convenient lie and something makes you choose truth instead. These moments might seem insignificant, but they're actually building something profound. You're creating new neural pathways, new habitual responses. You're training your mind in a different way of being. Over time, these small changes accumulate. The pauses before reacting become more frequent. The choices for integrity over expediency become more automatic. And gradually, you notice that your mind is different. The constant churning of judgment and resentment that used to fill your consciousness has quieted. You're still aware when things aren't going well, but you're not as hooked by it. You can see suffering without being overwhelmed by it. Your relationships begin to change. People notice that you're more present with them, more genuinely interested in their well-being. The defensive reactivity that used to create so much friction has softened. You're able to hear criticism without immediately counterattacking. You're able to acknowledge when you're wrong without it feeling like your entire self is being invalidated. This creates an atmosphere of safety and trust that allows relationships to deepen. Your relationship with yourself changes too. The harsh inner critic that used to dominate your mental landscape becomes less prominent. You're able to see your own mistakes and shortcomings without that translating into a sense that you're fundamentally flawed or worthless. You develop what the Buddhists call metta toward yourself, the same kind of patient, unconditional friendliness you're learning to extend to others. And perhaps most significantly, you begin to taste something that the tradition calls kusala sukha, the happiness that comes from wholesomeness. This is completely different from the pleasure that comes from getting what you want. That kind of pleasure is always tinged with anxiety because you know it won't last. You know you could lose it. You know you'll want more. But the happiness that comes from living ethically, from having a clear conscience, from knowing you're genuinely trying to be a force for good in the world that has a different quality. It's quieter, more stable, deeply satisfying. This doesn't mean everything in your external life suddenly becomes easy. You still face challenges, losses, disappointments. You still get sick, you still age, the people you love still die. The first noble truth that life involves suffering remains true. But your relationship to that suffering changes. It no longer has the power to completely destabilize you. You can hold it with more space, more equanimity, more wisdom. Think of it like this. Imagine you're a cup that's being filled with both pleasant and unpleasant experiences. When the cup is small, when your consciousness is narrow and reactive, even a small amount of unpleasant experience fills the cup completely and overflows into suffering. But as you practice, as you develop wisdom and compassion and mental spaciousness, the cup becomes larger. It becomes a basin, then a pond, then a lake. The same amount of unpleasant experience drops into it, but now there's so much more space that it barely registers. This is what happened with Angulimala. When he had developed his mind to the level of an arahant, when he had cultivated that vast, spacious awareness, the painful karmic results of his past actions still ripened. People still threw stones at him. But instead of that experience being overwhelming, instead of it destroying him, he could hold it with equanimity. The Buddha told him he was experiencing in this life what would have caused him eons of suffering in hell, but because of the transformation of his mind, he could bear it. Now, most of us aren't going to achieve the level of development that Angulimala did in this lifetime. Becoming an arahant is extraordinarily rare and requires conditions that few people have. But we can move in that direction. We can develop more patience, more compassion, more wisdom. We can become people who cause less suffering and experience less suffering, and that's worth everything. The continuous nature of practice. One final point I want to emphasize. The Buddhist path isn't something you do for a while until you're fixed and then you can stop. It's a way of life, a continuous practice of returning again and again to awareness, to ethics, to wisdom. Even highly advanced practitioners continue to practice. Why? Because the mind, like the body, needs ongoing care and training. Think of it like physical hygiene. You don't brush your teeth once and then decide you're done with dental care for life. You brush your teeth every day because bacteria are constantly accumulating. Mental practice works similarly. The mind is constantly accumulating the dust of unwholesome tendencies, reactivity, forgetfulness. And we need regular practice to cleanse that dust, to return to clarity. This doesn't mean you're failing if you need to keep practicing. It means you're succeeding at recognizing what's needed. The person who thinks they've achieved some final state where no more practice is needed has probably just stopped paying attention. As long as you're alive, as long as you're encountering the inevitable challenges of existence, you need practice. But here's the good news. Over time, practice becomes less effortful and more natural. It becomes less like something you have to force yourself to do and more like something you simply are. The person who has been practicing ethical conduct for years doesn't have to constantly resist the temptation to lie or steal. The resistance has become natural. The person who has been practicing meditation for years doesn't have to force themselves to sit. The mind naturally inclines toward that quality of attention. You're training the mind to flow in new channels, like water gradually carving new paths through rock. At first, the old channels are so deep and familiar that the water keeps flowing that way. But with consistent effort, new channels form and deepen, and eventually the water flows there instead. The old channels are still there. You could fall back into them if you stop being mindful, but they're no longer the default. This is why the teaching emphasizes the importance of spiritual friends and community. When you're part of a community of practitioners, you're surrounded by people for whom these new channels, these new ways of being, are normal. Their example helps establish new patterns in your own mind. You see living proof that it's possible to be more patient, more generous, more wise, more free. And that example is incredibly powerful. Your journey begins now, so here we are at the end of this exploration. We've covered vast territory, from the fundamental human tendency to go astray, to the extraordinary story of Angulimala's transformation, to the practical details of how you can begin your own journey of change. The question now is, what will you do with what you've heard? Everything I've shared with you comes from a tradition that's 2,500 years old, a tradition that has transformed countless lives across cultures and centuries. But it can't transform your life unless you engage with it. These aren't just interesting ideas to think about occasionally. They're practices to live by, teachings to test against your own experience, a path to actually walk. Remember what the Buddha said, "I am only one who shows the way. The seeing of the path is yours. The walking of the path is yours." He couldn't do the practice for others, and no one can do it for you. Your life, with all its unique circumstances and challenges, is the laboratory where you test these teachings. Your relationships are where you practice loving kindness. Your daily choices are where you train in ethics. Your own mind is where you develop wisdom. The opportunity you have right now is precious beyond measure. You've been born in a time and place where you can hear these teachings. You have the freedom to practice them. You have the intelligence to understand them. What you do with this opportunity is entirely up to you. You can let it slip away, always meaning to practice seriously but never quite getting around to it. Or you can seize it, make it central to your life, let it transform you from the inside out. If Angulimala, who had committed terrible acts, who was hated and feared by everyone who knew of him, could completely transform his life and achieve liberation, what excuse do any of us have? What he did wasn't superhuman. He didn't have any special powers that you lack. He simply had the great fortune to encounter the Buddha's teaching at a moment when he was ready to hear it, and he had the courage to change completely. You've encountered the teaching today. The question is, are you ready to hear it? Are you ready to let it challenge your assumptions, upset your comfortable patterns, and call you to something higher? Are you ready to acknowledge where you've gone astray and commit to returning to the right path? The path is there. It's been there all along, waiting for you to step onto it. Every moment of your life up until now has brought you to this point. All your mistakes, all your struggles, all your searching, they've led you here. And from here, you can go forward differently. Not perfectly, but consciously. Not without ever falling, but getting up each time you do. Not becoming someone else, but becoming more fully yourself, more fully human, more fully awake. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. What will your first step be? Maybe it's committing to just 10 minutes of quiet reflection each morning. Maybe it's choosing one ethical principle to really focus on this week. Maybe it's reaching out to find others who are walking this path. Whatever it is, take that step today. Not tomorrow when things are calmer. Not next week when you have more time. Today, right now, with all your imperfections and all your potential. The Buddha's final words to his disciples were, "Work out your liberation with diligence." Not with perfection, not with some special ability you don't have. With diligence, with patient, persistent effort. With the willingness to show up for practice again and again, even when it's difficult, even when you don't feel like it, even when you can't see immediate results. Because here's what I can promise you. If you engage sincerely with these practices, if you make them part of your daily life, you will change. Not maybe, not if you're lucky. You will change because these practices work. They've worked for millions of people across thousands of years. They've transformed monks and nuns, kings and beggars, scholars and illiterates. They work because they're based on understanding how the mind actually functions, not on belief or faith, but on direct investigation of reality. So begin. Right now, in this moment, make a commitment to yourself. Commit to being more conscious, more ethical, more kind. Commit to developing your understanding of how things really are. Commit to the path of awakening. And then, day by day, step by step, walk that path. The destination is freedom. The time to begin is now. May all beings find the path. May all beings walk the path to its end. May all beings be free.